Welcome to the Lending Forward podcast, brought to you by Atlantic Bay Mortgage Group. This is your home for real discussions about the mortgage and housing industry. Our hosts are here bringing you firsthand accounts every week from people at the heart of the business. And we're chatting with professionals from all corners of the industry as they help cultivate transparency around the future of the industry we love. Together, we are lending forward all we know to you. Thanks for joining us for today's episode. Let's dive in.
Welcome back to another episode of Lending Forward. I am your host, Hannah McManus, and I am extremely excited to be joined today by Laura Arce. Laura is the SVP of Economic Initiatives at UnidosUS, and we are going to talk all about Hispanic homeownership today. So thanks so much for joining the podcast. Hey, Laura.
Hi, Hannah. Thank you so much. I'm excited to have this conversation and appreciate being invited back.
Yeah, we had you on our Engaged webinar series about a month ago, and I thought that was so interesting, and you gave us so much information. So I'm excited to dig in a little bit more and go a little deeper around some of the things you touched on. So before we get started, tell me a little bit about UnidosUS and what you all are doing.
Yeah, so thank you. So UnidosUS is a national civil rights organization. And so that really is our North Star. And I often say the work that we do is all about closing gaps. So whether it's education gaps, health gaps, opportunity gaps, and the work that I do is very squarely focused on the homeownership gap. And, we're a multi-issue organization. So I have colleagues who work on health, education, workforce, civic engagement, and then certainly housing is one of our priority areas. Another thing about Unidos is that we're intermediary, and that means that we're not a direct service provider. We're not out there building housing or making loans or sitting down with clients one-on-one. But what we do instead is we support community-based organizations. We advance policy at the federal and state levels. We do a lot of research. We run programs regionally and locally, and we work doing communications. We like to do a lot of storytelling for the work that we do. And maybe the last thing I'll share about Unidos that I think is one of our superpowers is we have a national network of community-based affiliates, over 300 affiliates across the country, and they're the ones who are in local communities every day, helping local residents with whatever their issues or challenges might be.
I love that. And I know we've been working or partnered with you for, I think it's been over a year at this point, and we've learned so much from you. So we appreciate all of the things that UnidosUS is doing. So talk to me a little bit about closing these gaps. How are you all working to close the homeownership gaps?
Yeah, so, I wish there was an easy button to this challenge. But the work we do, it's focused around three areas. One is policy. Public policy is really important. We know that the housing sector in general, and especially the mortgage sector, are highly regulated. There's a lot of government involvement in terms of what, lenders and others can do or not do. And so we look at regulations, we look at where there's gaps around legislation and public policy, both at the federal and the state level. So things like around, lending requirements, and we certainly want guardrails for consumer protection. Sometimes there are, unintentional consequences of public policy that actually limit and restrict. And so, we try to be open-minded about that and advocate for that through that work, in Washington, D.C., and also in some of our priority states at the state capitol. Another thing we really focus on is research. We think data analytics and research are really critical to informing the best public policies, as well as stronger and more effective market practices. I think we can all agree that if we look back at the mortgage sector over the last, 20, 30 years, people live their economic lives very differently today than they did back then. But the mortgage market, it's conservative, and I think, rightly so. We don't want to get too crazy in terms of, expanding, increasing access to credit in ways that are detrimental to families. But at the same time, I think there's a lot of modernizing we can do in research and data help us kind of identify what those gaps are, and are we really assessing credit risk the right way? So those are some of the ways that we do the work that we do to advance, changes we want to see.
So you mentioned focus states. Are there specific, are there pockets of the country that are more, I guess, highly populated that we should, as a lending community, be focused on serving?
Yeah, so I think this is a really great question. So I'm going to answer it in a couple different ways. The first thing I'll note just about Unidos, we work nationwide. We do have 4 priority states, and they're California, Texas, Arizona, and Florida. And collectively, those states, the majority of Latinos in the U.S. live in one of those states. However, Hispanics are in every state, in the union. And so the work is broader, but those are just places where we do a little more focus and concentration. But it's really interesting to look at where we've seen growth in Hispanic homeownership and where we see opportunity. And, a couple things that if you, especially looking at the data in the last couple of years, that's been interesting to me is it's clear that Latinos are willing to relocate for the purpose of accessing home ownership, and in some cases that might mean moving to a different part of the state, or it might mean moving across the country. And so while there's certainly really strong, Hispanic population percentages in states like Texas and Florida and, California, we've seen a lot of movement of Hispanics to what, might relatively be more affordable states, places like Georgia and North Carolina, Illinois, Pennsylvania. And so I think, it's important to kind of look both broadly and specifically in those places.
That's interesting. Have you guys, is the data showing, or have you done the research of, yes, affordability is one thing, but are there other factors that they're open to moving for, or, reasons why they are willing to relocate for homeownership?
Yeah, I think it's the broader goal of economic opportunity. And homeownership, access, housing affordability is a piece of that. But certainly, job prospects, better quality of life, whether it's better schools. And so, in the last couple of years, we've seen a lot of internal migration of Latinos to different parts of the country. And I think a lot of the key driving forces are things like around economic opportunity.
Yeah. So this is a 2-part question for you. I really want us to dig into kind of the unique challenges that Hispanic home buyers are facing. That's part 1. But then part 2, because our listeners are, the majority of our listener base is loan officers and agents. So part 2 of that question is, how can we as a lending and real estate community better support our Hispanic home buyers in overcoming those hurdles?
Yeah. So I'll start with, the real big challenge, kind of a headline challenge for Hispanic home buyers is honestly what most home buyers are facing right now. So it's the combination of, lack of housing affordability combined with lack of inventory in a lot of markets across the country. And so you have that as a backdrop for anyone. When you look at Hispanic mortgage applicants, specifically, I think there are 3 things that jump out at me. First, is I'm sure your listeners know, the number 1 denial reason for a Hispanic mortgage applicant is debt to income, DTI. And looking at it from the lens of a Hispanic borrower, a lot of that has to do with high housing costs. And so there is this concentration of Hispanics in high cost markets such as California. But that's increasingly an issue in many states. And then the other, generally speaking, if you look at trends around median income relative to median home prices, Hispanics tend to have lower median incomes, compared to other households in most markets of the country. And so you add that to the housing affordability, your debt to income ratio is gonna skew. And it's, for a lot of folks, that's a really big challenge, especially right now with, relative, the interest rates, in the last past year plus being relatively higher than they have been, in the years leading up to, through the pandemic. A second big issue is credit history. Yeah. And so, Latinos are more likely than other groups to either have poor credit or be credit invisible, meaning not having any credit history. And I think, there are a lot of reasons for that. Certainly, Hispanics are also less likely to be banked or be in the formal financial sector, which I think is very much related to building that credit history. I think also for a lot of Latinos, not all, but certainly those who are newer immigrants and closer to the immigration, story in their family, the cultural attitudes towards debt is very different in other countries as it is in the US. And so part of that is understanding what the credit norms are in the US and what's expected. So
will you go deeper into that? What are because I was born here. I've lived here my whole life. I only know one way. What, talk to me about our normal versus
right. So
what they consider normal, I guess.
Yeah. So I'm going to share a little bit of a personal story that for me really illustrates it. And I think and I've seen it and I've heard it from others that my best friend in college, her parents helped her buy a car when she was going to college. And they basically paid for it. But what they did is even though they could have paid cash for the car, they created a bank account where they put all the money for the car and then set up the payments to be automatically deducted every month. And she never had to touch it or worry about it. And so, she was building, her parents knew she was 18 going off to college and she needed to start building really strong credit. On the other hand, when I think about my family, and I often, like to talk about my grandfather, who really did not believe in credit at all. He thought it was a bad thing to be in debt to someone. And, his story is, he had a bank account where he saved his money and that was it. He never had a credit card. He lived most of his adult life in the US. And every month when he would get his utility or his phone bill, he would go downtown to the main office and he would pay that bill in cash and ask for a receipt, with the official paid stamp on it. And he would save those receipts for years. And so, certainly it never would have occurred to him or my parents, at 18 to help set up a system like my friend's family did to help her build that strong credit.
I love that story so much. That's the stories that you hear is like, there's cash under the mattress or, there's cash, there's plenty of money, there's no credit.
Right.
You hear that a decent amount.
Of course, yeah. And intuitively, it's not a bad thing, right? It's like, it's, not having, I would love to not have a mortgage anymore and have that paid off and not have any debt. And so, not having around you. So I think for, a lot of, immigrants especially, again, in the US, there's a little more of a nuanced understanding about certainly you don't want to be in over your head. Credit card interest rates are really high right now. But at the same time, there's responsible ways to use credit. And that credit score means so much. And I think if for some folks, that's a little more intuitive than for maybe more recent immigrants.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing is education around the importance of credit is very, very important when talking to, especially first-time home buyers in this in the Hispanic community.
Yeah, absolutely. When you think about what loan officers, agents and others who are working with Hispanic home buyers can do, especially to your point, I think first time home buyers, and I would even say like first generation home buyers, all of that education is so critical. For a lot of folks who are maybe the first in their families to buy a home, they may not have grown up with that, kind of understanding of like, the mortgage payment and what that means. And they may not have someone, who's a trusted, family member or someone close to the family who can give them advice around selecting the right house or selecting the right mortgage product. And so I think, education around what the process is, what's needed, how to build strong credit or improve your credit so that you can get better terms on your mortgage are really important. And, I'll say that, Hispanics are really motivated around homeownership. It's something that just consistently, when I talk with families and individuals across the country, it's something that's like, that's certainly very high on the list of life goals, and it's a marker of success, for being in this country. And so I think what that means is if you help a Hispanic home buyer understand the process, give them a roadmap, even if that journey is going to take longer than they thought because they need to work on their credit, they need to save a little bit more in down payment, whatever that might be. I have found consistently that people will do the hard work. They'll make the sacrifices. They just want to know what the steps are needed to get there, and they'll work toward that goal.
That's awesome. When it comes to education, I know there's data around how millennials adjust education and how Gen Zs and everyone takes in information differently, and everyone gets advice in a different form or fashion. So have you guys done any research around how the Hispanic community would prefer to be educated?
Yeah, I think there's certainly, of course, nuance. It's hard sometimes to make generalizations, but I think there are a few things that jump out at me, and I think your point around the generations and age is a real key, definition, whether you're Hispanic or not. Mm-hmm. And so certainly when I started working, in the space over 20 years ago, we talked a lot about the importance of like in-person, one-on-one counseling and education. And I think for a lot of people, they still want that. They want to have like the booklet in front of them. They want someone to sit down with them and really, really, kind of talk them through the process, help them understand their situation. But, Hispanics, one of the demographic trends that we're seeing is that Hispanics are, the median age of Latinos is much younger than the population overall. And so we're certainly over-indexed in younger folks. And, we just like all, younger, people in the United States, like we're just much more tech savvy. We're much more comfortable doing things, on our phone, just, holding there. So I think certainly for a lot of the younger generation, I think, apps and having, roadmaps, in terms of, see where you are in the process are really helpful.
Mm-hmm. Talk to me about language barriers. When you say younger generation, I'm thinking there's more bilingual Hispanics in America than non-bilingual. Am I totally off base in saying that?
No, I think it's a really great point. And I think it's also something that's a little more nuanced, and sometimes people talk about, like when we, there's a lot of work in the public policy space around language access. And, we talk about people with limited English proficiency. Mm-hmm. And, within the Hispanic community, it's not one or the other, necessarily. And so certainly I would say, 70% of Hispanics in the U.S. are born in the U.S. And so we were born here, we grew up here, we're native English speakers. If you're an immigrant, your level of English is going to really depend on what capacity in English you had arriving in this country and how long you've been here. For most, immigrants, the longer they've been here, the stronger they are and more comfortable they are in English. But then there's this middle ground of, this, being bilingual, multilingual. And I think within the Hispanic community, one is just understanding first kind of what people's preferred language is. And I have found that it often depends on the situation. And so on the one hand, you could talk about, buying a house, going through the mortgage process, it's complicated and confusing for anybody, no matter, what language, right? Even if you're a native English speaker. And so for some individuals, it's really important to them that they, that they have the information in Spanish, in the language that they're most comfortable with, both verbally and documentation. On the other hand, for those, which I think is the majority of Hispanics in the U.S. who are some level of bilingual, comfortable in both English and Spanish, they might be more comfortable talking with their family and their friends in Spanish and having more social interactions. But because chances are that they did most of their education in the U.S., more kind of technical terms, which the mortgage process has plenty of those, they're going to be potentially more comfortable in English for that type of transaction. So I think it's really important to just have a really good sense of for that consumer and not make assumptions based on their, how long they've been in the country or what generation they are. And then just one other point I would make about language is for a lot of Hispanics, it's a cultural point of pride. And so I think when lenders and others, when they do marketing in Spanish, when they do, bilingual, when they have Spanish-speaking loan officers, even if that's not necessary, like for me, for example, I'm very comfortable doing, I honestly, I would prefer to do the whole process in English. But when I see a company, that is, reaching out through language, I relate more to that company, and it builds a level of trust and they see me. And so I would say that even beyond just what someone wants, what language you want for the process, there is a strong value in language as a cultural representation.
And that kind of leads me to my next question, which I don't know if you guys have data on this, but if you do, I'd love to hear it, is how are homeowners or home buyers finding their real estate agent or their preferred lender? I mean, are they going online? Are they doing their homework first, or is it word of mouth, or is it because of a friend? I mean, how do they prefer to find someone?
Yeah, so I think, I don't have the hard data, but just in talking with, housing counselors and home buyers in different parts of the country, I think, the number one method right now is still that trusted word of mouth. Mm-hmm. And so people are going to ask, I should take a step back. We did a poll. It's not about a year and a half old now around, who do you trust, for information. It was specific around housing and mortgages. And the top 2 or 3 responses were all around, family, friends, coworkers, and especially if they have gone through the process themselves already. And so that's going to be the first place if they know that their cousin successfully bought a house, they're going to, and they don't know where to start, they're going to ask their cousin, how did you do it? And if the cousin was happy with their, realtor or their loan officer, they're going to pass along that contact information. So I think that's still a really, really powerful, way to think about it within the Hispanic community. But then, of course, again, now, especially with a lot of the younger generation, online searches is still, really, really common, especially if you're kind of trying to find someone in your area. And I would say there that sometimes the information can be really overwhelming. And so it's really helpful to have someone who can kind of help you navigate the process. But that would be a secondary. But I think that trusted, source of information is still the number one way that people find their contacts.
Okay. I know I didn't want to get into this, but we're recording on November 7th, so I have to ask. And I know it's early, but, with a new administration moving into office in January, what do you think that means for the Hispanic homeownership in general?
Yeah, so I think, one thing that was very clear from the election and honestly leading up to it, I mean, we've done polling, others have done polling, that the economy, cost of living, and specifically housing, housing affordability, whether it's, rents, which have impact on being able to, save for down payment, or the cost of, buying that first, starter house. That was a really big top issue for the electorate. And so, I'm optimistic that because one, it was such a clear, I feel like that's really the primary mandate that the voters communicated, on election day. And that combined if you look at any of the data, housing affordability, housing access is a challenge right now everywhere. A number of years ago, it felt very much like a coastal issue, but now it's in every state in the country, urban areas, rural areas, suburban areas, red states, blue states, purple states. And so I'm really optimistic that, policymakers are going to see that. And it's certainly the new administration coming in. It's the new, Congress that will be sworn in January. And I would be shocked if housing policy, whether it's around, expanding the building of affordable housing for both homeownership and rental, as well as pathways for, first-time buyers to, access homeownership. Like, I would be shocked if those weren't very high on the list, especially when we think about the high likelihood that we're going to see a new tax package next year. So I think some of that will be delivered through taxes, through a tax reform.
Okay. Before I ask you our signature question, is there anything that our listeners, and again, they're mostly, loan officers and agents, going into 2025, anything that should be top of mind for them on ways to build trust and educate and really serve the Hispanic communities that they're in?
Yeah, I think, there are a few things that they can do. I mean, first, the earlier point about, just understanding where an individual home buyer and their family, where they are, and that happens, regardless, but certainly for Hispanic, home buyers, thinking about things like, not just, what's the process and what's the pathway for me, but even things, Hispanics are more likely to be self-employed or have gig work, that can add complexity to the underwriting process. Hispanics also have larger household sizes, start families younger, are more likely to live in multi-generational households. So what are the implications for that in terms of both the type of house they need, but also thinking about how they potentially combine resources in order to afford, a mortgage. And so I think just having that strong understanding. I think secondly is being really honest about what the pathway is for that individual. And again, for some folks, it might be, they might be ready now. Others, it might be months. And for some, it might be a year or 2 years, that what their journey is. But clearly, like not just kind of turning them away if they're not ready, but explaining to them, this is the pathway. I mean, that's why they may not be the customer today, but if they trust that you've given them the right information, they'll certainly come back and then they'll refer all of their cousins and friends. And then the last, piece I would offer is another potential resource is, especially for those home buyers that really have a longer path in front of them around whether it's repairing credit or saving for a down payment. I would encourage loan officers and, real estate agents to think about the resources around, nonprofit housing counselors who are often, that it's a free resource. We have a network and they're often willing to work with, home buyers in that longer journey and then kind of refer back to the loan officer, when that time is right, because we know everyone's busy and maybe that hand-holding over 2 years isn't the best use of time for everybody.
That's really great advice. And I mean, I'm really excited about the future of Hispanic homeownership. I think we've made big strides, and I think there's a lot of big strides to still come. But just in talking to you, it sounds like if you can provide that additional service, that extra hand-holding, and, make it really special for those home buyers, I mean, the loyalty is there. And I think I don't want to say pay dividends, but I mean, the 2 years of work you'll make up for the 2 years of work.
Yes. Yeah. No, I believe that very much. I think that's true.
Well, I can't let you leave without asking our signature question, which is, how are you going to lend it forward in 2025?
Oh my goodness. I should have been prepared in advance.
I know, I should have prepped you.
Your...
Sorry. And you can take it any way you want to take it.
Yeah, no, but I think for me, just really, continuing the work that I'm doing and elevating the importance of Hispanic homeownership, not just for Hispanic families and the Hispanic community, but the country as a whole. I mean, demographically, Hispanics, are increasingly, the future of housing and homeownership in this country. So I think for me, I'm going to be advocating around public policies and especially around any tax proposals that are going to be targeted to helping that first-time home buyer, whether it's through some type of down payment assistance or incentives to build more affordable entry-level homes. So that's what I'm, preparing for and planning on focusing on in 2025.
That's awesome. Well, I so much appreciate you coming on. You're turning into a friend of Lending Forward in Atlantic Bay. So we very much appreciate you and hope you have a great rest of the year.
Yeah, you too. And I look forward to hopefully being invited back sometime in 2025.
Thanks again for tuning into today's episode of the Lending Forward podcast. Be sure to subscribe to our channel, follow us on Instagram @LendingForward, on YouTube and LinkedIn. Tune in next week for another new episode and go lend something forward today. Atlantic Bay Mortgage Group, LLC, NMLS number 72043, NMLSconsumeraccess.org is an equal opportunity lender and employer located at 600 Lynn Haven Parkway, Suite 100, Virginia Beach, Virginia 23452.